Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Case of the Forgotten Spice Jar. Chapter 1. The Cinnamon Note. It was an autumn morning of the most respectable kind, the sort that made even London's fog seem orderly. The pale sun glinted off the River Thames, and a lazy hush had settled over Battersea, as though the world itself were pausing to sip its tea. But that calm was soon fractured by the clanging bell of a delivery bicycle weaving toward 43 Gainsborough Mews. The residence was a handsome 4-story townhome, draped in ivy and flanked by polished iron gates. A black and gold brass plate beside the front door read, Miss Calpurnia Edevane, gastronomist and historical culinary consultant. Inside, the faint scent of nutmeg and bergamot drifted through the kitchen where Miss Edevane's housekeeper, Mrs. Braithwaite, was brewing the first pot of tea. The silence was broken by a sharp gasp, followed by the crashing of porcelain. The scream came next. By the time the constable arrived, summoned by a passing postman who had heard the commotion, the household was in disarray. Mrs. Braithwaite, cheeks drained of all colour, stood trembling at the threshold of the conservatory. Inside lay Miss Edevane, elegant even in death, her grey curls pinned with precision, one hand curled around the base of an antique spice jar. She was seated, slumped ever so slightly in a velvet armchair, as though she had merely nodded off. But the stiffness in her neck and the slight tilt of her head told another story. Her eyes, partially open, stared toward the glass roof above, where vines of clematis trailed like curious witnesses. On the mahogany side table beside her sat a teacup, its rim kissed with a faint trace of cinnamon, and a silver tray bearing a slice of almond cake, untouched. Nothing appeared to have been forced. No windows broken, no signs of struggle. And yet, something was undeniably wrong. It was Mrs. Braithwaite who spotted it first. The spice jar clutched in Miss Edevane's hand was out of place. Though her kitchen was a meticulous archive of rare ingredients, she would never have allowed such a relic to be used in casual service. The jar was from her prized forgotten flavors collection, ceramic vessels dating back to the 1700s, each sealed and catalogued with obsessive care. This one was labelled Cinnamomum Verum, true cinnamon. Inspector Graves of Scotland Yard arrived just before noon. A practical man in his 50s, he stood frowning in the conservatory, glancing from the lifeless figure to the delicate jar. His assistant, Constable Bell, took photos and made notes in an orderly fashion. Housekeeper says the spice jars were part of a new lecture series Miss Edevane was preparing, Graves murmured. She was to present on the psychology of taste memory, said flavour was the gateway to forgotten emotion. Constable Bell, not much moved by poetic ideas, simply nodded. What's more, Graves continued, this one wasn't supposed to be opened. All the others are intact. But this one, he gestured toward the open jar, has been tampered with. He bent over to inspect the teacup. No obvious signs of poison, no broken skin or bruises, nothing stolen. It's as if she just died. At that moment, a subtle voice broke the stillness, or rather was allowed to die. Both men turned to see a short, impeccably dressed figure standing at the conservatory door. The moustache was precise, the cane polished, and the eyes sharp as glass. Good heavens, Graves breathed. Monsieur Poirot? I happened to be in London on business, said Poirot with a courteous incline of his head. And Miss Eddervane was an acquaintance of mine. She once cooked me a curry that nearly made me weep. He glanced at the scene with delicate precision. This, he said softly, was not a natural death. Graves raised a brow. You think it's murder? I think, Poirot replied, stepping lightly into the conservatory, it is a message, one written in cinnamon and silence. He reached out without touching and studied the spice jar. Tell me, Inspector, he asked, do you know what cinnamon means in ancient Persian rituals? Graves blinked. Number. It means remembrance. Poirot's gaze settled on the untouched cake, the loosened lid of the jar, and the faint trace of powder that rimmed the teacup. His lips pressed into a line. A murder, perhaps, he said quietly, not of impulse, but of memory. Chapter 2. The spice drawer was locked. It was well past noon by the time the coroner's van departed, and the house at 43 Gainsborough Mews returned to a haunted quiet. In the kitchen, the kettle had long since gone cold, and the scent of cinnamon had faded into something sharper, metallic, almost bitter. Hercule Poirot stood with hands behind his back, surveying the room with the kind of reverence one might reserve for a sacred temple. For to Miss Calpurnia Eddervane, this kitchen had been precisely that. Observe, Inspector, Poirot said gently, gesturing toward a narrow oak cabinet near the hearth. The spice drawer, a rather modest name for something so meticulously constructed. Graves stepped forward, squinting at the structure. It was a custom-built unit with 12 identical square drawers, each labelled in Miss Eddervane's looping hand. None of them bore the mark of cinnamon. Housekeeper said the rare spices were kept in her study, Graves muttered. These here are for daily use, basil, clove, sage, the usual lot. Poirot nodded. Precisely. And note, none of the drawers have been opened. Dust patterns, Inspector. Do not overlook them. A jar used recently would disturb the thin veil of dust atop its label. Bell looked closer. They're clean as a whistle. Or untouched for weeks, Poirot replied. He moved toward the pantry, which was lined with hand-sealed tins and glass jars, all labelled in French, Latin, and occasionally Sanskrit. At the centre, in a recessed glass cabinet, sat the pride of Calpurnia Eddervane's collection, the Forgotten Flavours archive, or almost all of it. Poirot leaned in. Do you see, monsieur? There is an empty slot, third row, second from the left. Its absence leaves a faint ring of unfaded wood. Graves stepped beside him, muttering under his breath. The missing jar, cinnamomum verum. So she removed it herself? Poirot tilted his head. Or someone else did. The cabinet is locked, or rather, he reached toward the side panel and tugged. Was supposed to be. The doors swung open easily. Graves stiffened. But the housekeeper said, that it was always kept locked, yes, Poirot finished. She also said Miss Eddervane had only one key. Tell me, where is it? Mrs. Braithwaite, who stood wringing her hands in the hallway, stepped forward reluctantly. It's not in her pocket, sir, nor on her desk upstairs, and the one she kept in the locket chain. That chain's still on her neck, but the locket's open. Empty. Someone took the key, Graves asked. Or used it, Poirot murmured. You say she was preparing a lecture, oui? One that involved these spices. Mrs. Braithwaite nodded quickly. She'd been working for weeks on something called gustatory memory and emotional deception. Said she wanted to prove that flavours could unlock truth better than any interrogation. Graves snorted. Sounds mad. Poirot smiled faintly. And yet profoundly clever. Miss Edivane understood the mind through the tongue. She once told me a man's first memory of betrayal often tastes like something he never forgot. Bell glanced up from the spiced drawers. Then what would cinnamon mean, sir? Depends entirely on the taster, Poirot said. The group moved to Miss Edivane's study. It was a marvel of design, walls lined with culinary tomes, vintage menus from defunct Parisian restaurants, and delicate scrolls on the herbal philosophies of ancient China. A heavy mahogany desk faced the wide bay window. Papers had been stacked with mathematical precision until someone had gone through them. Poirot bent over the surface. Inspector, do you see here? The blotter has been rotated. The impression beneath is inverted. Someone flipped it hastily. Graves frowned. You think they were searching for something? Poirot opened a small drawer and extracted a spiral-bound notebook. Lecture drafts, confidential. Voila. He flipped through pages until he reached one that had been torn out, cleanly, almost surgically. The missing page? Graves asked. Perhaps the one describing the cinnamon, Poirot replied. Poirot's gaze then fell to a faint ring of condensation on the right side of the desk, too far from the usual spot for a teacup. He studied it silently, then looked back at the housekeeper. Madam Braithwaite, you say you brewed the tea? I did. Brought it to her in the conservatory like always. And the cake? She baked it herself the day before. Almond sponge. Her favourite. Was there anyone else in the house this morning? Mrs. Braithwaite hesitated. Just her nephew, Mr. Giles. Graves looked up from the papers. Nephew? Mrs. Braithwaite nodded. Mr. Giles Edivane, her late brother's son, been staying the week. She said he needed smoothing out. Something about an inheritance claim he kept pestering her about. Poirot's brows lifted. And where is this monsieur now? He left early, sir, she said with a wrinkled frown. Said he had an appointment at the Royal Academy, but he seemed twitchy. Didn't even say goodbye. Poirot exchanged a glance with Graves. Inspector, Poirot said softly, you may wish to find this nephew. I have a feeling that young Giles has developed a very particular taste for danger. Graves turned to Constable Bell. Put out a request. Full name, Giles Edivane. Let's see who last saw him, and where. Poirot lingered in the study a moment longer, his fingers tracing the rim of the empty locket now tucked in an evidence bag. A key goes missing. A rare spice is removed. A memory meant to be buried is stirred. Poirot closed the notebook and whispered to himself. There is more to this recipe than flavour, mon ami. It is a recipe for fear. Chapter 3. A House Full of Motives. The drawing room of 43 Gainsborough Mews had once hosted ambassadors, opera singers, and gastronomic legends from across Europe. Now it held only silence, and 5 uneasy individuals seated at polite distances from one another. Graves had decided, with Poirot's quiet approval, that the house's remaining occupants should not leave until preliminary questioning had been conducted. Poirot stood by the fireplace observing his new suspects like a conductor scanning his orchestra. Each one, he knew, played a different tune, but somewhere among them was a note off-key. Let us begin, if you please, Poirot announced gently. I find that people speak more truly in rooms they have not prepared themselves to lie in. Graves nodded, stepping aside to let the Belgian take the lead. Poirot turned to the first guest. A young woman of striking poise sat nearest the window. She wore a pale green dress and held a closed book in her lap, one of Miss Edivane's culinary memoirs, though she had not turned a page since entering the room. You are Mademoiselle Cecily Grant, are you not? She nodded. Miss Edavane's assistant. Well, her research assistant. I was compiling historical data for her lecture. And this morning? Poirot asked. Where were you? In the attic study, organizing recipe cards from the Roman Empire collection. She wanted them digitized for slides. Poirot raised a brow. The attic? Did you hear the commotion when the housekeeper screamed? I did, she replied, tightening her grip on the book. I dropped everything and ran down, but by then it was too late. Poirot studied her face. Calm, but almost too calm. Her voice betrayed none of the tremor he might expect from someone who had just lost a mentor. You did not go to the conservatory immediately. I didn't know where the scream had come from. I checked the kitchen first, then the drawing room. Poirot nodded slowly. And how long have you worked for Miss Edavane? 6 months, she said. I'm a food historian by training. She said I had a tongue for timelines. Graves stepped in. Did you know about the spice jar collection? Of course, she replied. She kept it under lock and key. I only ever saw her open it once, and even then, she wore gloves. Gloves? Poirot echoed. She believed touch could contaminate memory, Cecily said, not scientifically but symbolically. Poirot offered a quiet smile. How poetic. Next was a man seated in the corner with a wiry frame and the restlessness of someone accustomed to performance. His fingers tapped a silent rhythm on his trousers. You are Mr. Lionel Webb? Yes, theatre critic, occasional dinner guest. He smiled weakly. Calpurnia and I shared a fascination with old recipes. She once recreated a Tudor feast based solely on my description of a Shakespearean stage note. And when did you arrive today? Poirot asked. Around 10. I was early. She'd invited me to preview her presentation, said she wanted my opinion on how to stage it theatrically, but she wasn't ready to see me. So Mrs. Braithwaite gave me tea in the blue room, which is on the ground floor. He nodded. I was reading when the scream came. I ran straight to the conservatory. I was the first to see her, I think, before even Mrs. Braithwaite went in. Poirot's eyebrows flicked upward. You did not touch the body? No, Webb said quickly. I'm squeamish, frankly. Poirot turned slightly. Yet you knew where the conservatory was? Webb hesitated. Yes, she gave me the house tour weeks ago. She said her herbs lived where the light understood them. A vague answer. Poirot filed it away. The third guest, seated rigidly on a floral armchair, was a woman in her 60s. She wore a dress of fine wool and pearls, and her silver hair was styled with deliberation. Madame? Mrs. Honoria Pell, she said with clipped precision, Calpurnia's cousin on her mother's side. We weren't especially close, but she had asked me here to discuss family affairs. Poirot smiled gently. Such as? Mrs. Pell hesitated, clearly weighing whether honesty suited her. There was an inheritance matter. My husband left me a portion of the Edavane Trust, which Calpurnia controlled. There were delays. I assumed today's meeting would resolve them. Poirot inclined his head. You arrived alone? Yes. The driver dropped me off at 11 sharp. I waited in the sitting room for 20 minutes before Mrs. Braithwaite told me Calpurnia had passed. You did not see Miss Edavane this morning? Number. Nor did I take tea. I found the whole scene quite vulgar. Poirot offered a polite nod, but said nothing more. The fourth guest sat nearest the door, fidgeting with a napkin. A red-cheeked man with salt and pepper sideburns and a nose that had known several rugby seasons. Dr. Ellery, retired, he said before being asked. Old friend of the family. I was supposed to check in on Calpurnia's arthritis and blood pressure. She cancelled our last 2 appointments. Poirot leaned forward. And today, I came to insist she rest. The lecture had her overworked, but the door was open when I arrived. I walked in, found the house in a mess of confusion. Poor Braithwaite nearly collapsed into my arms. Graves interjected. "What time did you get here?" "About 11:30, Ellery replied. She was gone by then. Poirot noticed something peculiar. All 4 visitors had arrived within a short window, and none of them had seen the others until after the death was discovered. "Strange, is it not?" Poirot mused aloud. That on the same morning, Miss Edevane was to meet her assistant, a cousin with legal matters, a doctor friend, and a theatrical critic. Quite the assembly. "Coincidence?" Graves murmured. "No, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "It is never coincidence. It is orchestration." He stepped back from the fireplace, surveying the room once more. And yet one voice is still missing. The nephew. A beat of silence. Mrs. Braithwaite entered with fresh tea and a troubled expression. "Inspector," she said, voice low, "we've just received word. Mr. Giles Edevine was seen boarding a train at Paddington, bound for Oxfordshire." Poirot's expression did not change, but his voice lowered an octave. "Then let us find the man who fled from remembrance," while the scent of cinnamon was still in the air. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives too early. The next morning dawned crisp and blue, as if the sky had been scoured clean of the cinnamon-scented death that haunted the previous day. Yet Hercule Poirot, ever alert to the residue of secrets, knew better than to be charmed by weather. He arrived promptly at Scotland Yard by 10, dressed in a pale grey suit with matching gloves, and a tie as neat as a ribbon on a sealed confession. Inside, Inspector Graves was already poring over a rail timetable. He glanced up as Poirot entered, gesturing toward a half-drunk cup of tea. "No sign of Giles Edevane," Graves grumbled. "He boarded a train to Oxfordshire at 10:13 yesterday morning, but by the time we traced him to the Eversley Inn in Henley, he was gone again, left his suitcase, took the locket chain with him." Poirot seated himself delicately. "So he abandons luggage but clings to symbolism. Curious." "He's hiding something," Graves muttered. "But not from the law," Poirot said gently. "From himself. A man does not flee with a family heirloom unless he believes it will protect him. From truth, perhaps more than justice." Graves sighed. "I've set a tail on every station in and out of London. Bell's interviewing the staff at the inn." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And the body of Mademoiselle Edevane?" "Post-mortem completed early this morning," Graves said, handing over a typewritten sheet. "Cause of death: cardiac arrest induced by an alkaloid poison. Trace amounts of berberine." Poirot's eyes lit up. "Berberine," he repeated softly, "found in golden seal root, and in some species of cinnamomum bark, but not verum, not true cinnamon." Graves blinked. "So whoever killed her used a fake spice?" "Worse," Poirot said. "They used truth disguised as memory. Miss Edevane prized her spices not only for flavour, but for what they evoked. Someone weaponized that. They gave her something she thought she knew, only to let it betray her." Graves shook his head. "All this over a jar?" Poirot rose, smoothing his lapels. "Non, mon ami, not over a jar, over what the jar represented: memory, power, and, I suspect, inheritance." They returned to Gainsborough Mews by noon. The air inside the townhouse had settled into a strange equilibrium, a blend of order and mourning. Mrs. Braithwaite greeted them stiffly, her eyes still red-rimmed. Poirot addressed her with warmth. "Madame, you knew her best. May I trouble you for a small tour of her kitchen once more?" She nodded. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. They stepped into the sun-dappled kitchen. Poirot immediately veered toward the tea cupboard. Rows of delicate canisters stood lined like soldiers. He opened one labelled Assam and inhaled, briefly. Would Miss Edivane ever have mixed her spices directly into the tea? Mrs. Braithwaite shook her head. Number she believed each ingredient deserved its own voice. She never muddled them. If she used cinnamon, it was as a garnish, on top of milk foam or cake, never steeped. Poirot moved to the rubbish bin, neatly tied and placed beneath the sink. He opened it with a handkerchief and pulled out the used tea bag from the day before. A faint trace of golden dust clung to the paper sachet. Strange, he thought, for a pure Assam blend. He slipped it into a small evidence envelope. Merci. Now, may I see her bedroom? Upstairs, the bedroom was as meticulous as the rest of the house. Floral wallpaper, a mahogany armoire, and a side table adorned with a photograph of a younger Calpurnia beside a smiling man, her brother, no doubt. Beside it sat a velvet box. Poirot opened it gently. Inside were 3 identical keys, all labelled FF Archive. Graves raised a brow. So she had backups. Poirot shook his head. Or someone planted them to imply she was careless. Tell me, Madame Braithwaite, did you ever see more than one key? Never, she said. Only the one she wore on that locket. Poirot took a small silver spoon from the side table drawer and scraped gently beneath the box. A fine line of dust shifted, revealing that the box had been moved recently. The rest of the dresser was dusted evenly. Then this box, he said softly, was placed here after her death. They moved next into the attic study where Miss Cecily Grant had claimed to be during the time of the murder. Boxes of recipe cards sat on the floor, many open, some partially sorted. An old projector stood near the window, half covered by a linen cloth. Poirot examined the desk. A sheaf of notes was tucked beneath a weighty leather-bound copy of The Language of Taste, a psychological atlas. He opened the top page. Lecture outline, do not duplicate. Cinnamon, the deceiver's spice. Used in mourning rituals in Sri Lanka. Induces false warmth. Associated with betrayal in Middle Eastern folklore. Pairs well with almond to soften bitterness. Poirot read the final line aloud, then turned toward Graves. She was trying to teach her audience how flavor manipulates perception. A spice that feels like comfort, but means danger. An almond cake meant to soothe, and yet paired with poison. Someone used her own ideas against her, Graves murmured. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, and they did so with knowledge, not only of chemistry, but of her past. Graves frowned. What past? Poirot returned to the desk and retrieved a torn envelope. It was addressed to Calpurnia Edivane, C. aux Maisons Fleuries, Avignon, France. Postmarked 1983. Poirot turned to Mrs. Braithwaite. Did Miss Edivane ever live in France? She hesitated. Only briefly, after her brother died. Said she needed silence to think. She never talked about it. Poirot held the envelope closer. Inside was a single note in a delicate hand. You must forgive me eventually, or I'll never rest. No signature. Graves looked over his shoulder. You think this connects to the murder? Poirot closed the envelope with precision. I think, Inspector, that Miss Edivane was a woman who buried pain in flavors, and someone, somewhere, decided to dig it up. He straightened his cuffs. And if Giles Edivane does not return to us by his own will, then we must unearth him, just as someone unearthed that forgotten spice jar. Chapter 5. The Assistant's Contradiction. By early afternoon, Poirot had requested that all members of the household and guests be gathered once more in the drawing room. Though the air held a tense civility, beneath it ran a taut wire of suspicion. Each suspect seemed to recognize, consciously or otherwise, that the tone of Poirot's inquiries had shifted, from general to pointed, from observation to implication. Inspector Graves stood silently near the mantel, watching Cecily Grant with a narrowed gaze. Poirot, however, remained seated, polishing his cufflinks with a small white cloth, as though the mystery were a wrinkle in fabric rather than a question of death. He looked up, eyes gleaming. Mademoiselle Grant, I wish to return briefly to your statement from yesterday. You said you were in the attic study during the time of Miss Edivane's death, oui? Yes, she replied evenly, sorting Roman recipe cards. And yet, Poirot continued, when Madame Braithwaite screamed, you said you came down and checked the kitchen first. She nodded. That's right. Poirot tapped his index finger against his knee. A curious route. The kitchen is on the ground floor, directly beneath the pantry. The conservatory, however, is visible from the staircase landing. If you had descended in a panic, as one, might after hearing such a scream you would likely have seen the open conservatory doors, no? Cecily blinked. I suppose. I wasn't thinking clearly. Non, Poirot said gently. You were thinking very clearly, too clearly. You did not rush. You hesitated. You were ensuring you would not be seen first. Cecily's face flushed. That's absurd. I didn't even know what had happened. Yet you claimed you heard the scream distinctly, Poirot said, voice soft but unrelenting. Loud enough to rush down? That suggests proximity. I already explained. Allow me to explain what you did not, Poirot interrupted with unusual sharpness. I believe you were not in the attic at all. I believe you were in the corridor outside the conservatory. There was a heavy silence. Graves stepped forward. Miss Grant, if you were nearer than you claimed, that puts you potentially at the scene, at the moment of death. I wasn't, Cecily said quickly. I had no reason, no cause, to be anywhere near her. Ah, Poirot said, rising. But you did, or rather someone believed you did. He opened a small envelope and removed the torn lecture draft he had found the day before in the attic study. He handed it to Graves. Recovered from beneath a filing box in the attic, someone tried to hide it. Graves scanned it. It's about trust psychological association, and how almond flavor can be used to suppress bitterness. Poirot nodded. A precise theory, one Cecily would have known intimately. I believe she helped draft it, perhaps even co-wrote the examples. Cecily's lips parted. She let me help her outline some of the case studies. That's not unusual. No, Poirot agreed, but she intended to cite you as co-author, did she not? I don't know. Maybe, Cecily said. She hadn't said. Poirot stepped forward, his voice a silk thread. And did she not also say, just days ago, that she might credit only herself? Cecily paused. She said she hadn't decided yet, that it was her final lecture. She wanted to make it her own. Graves frowned. So you had motive? No, Cecily said firmly. I was disappointed, yes, but not angry. It wasn't mine to own. Poirot looked her over. And yet, your fingerprints were on the envelope containing the torn draft. Why hide it? Cecily faltered. I didn't kill her. I found the page yesterday morning on the desk. I thought she had discarded it, so I took it. I thought maybe it had something to do with the poison? Poirot finished. She looked down. I didn't know it then. I just knew something felt wrong. Poirot stepped back. Very well. Let us assume that you merely lied about your location and tampered with a discarded draft. Still, it is not you whom I suspect of the actual act." Cecily looked up in surprise. "Then, who?" Poirot turned toward Mrs. Braithwaite. "Madame," he said warmly, "there is one detail that troubles me." The housekeeper straightened. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. You said that the tea was brewed by your hand, yes?" She nodded. "And served directly to Miss Edevane?" "Yes, as I always did." "And yet," he said slowly, "you were not in the conservatory when the scream was heard." "I had stepped away to polish the brass railings in the front corridor." "A convenient absence," Poirot said. "Tell me, who else might have had the opportunity to switch the teacup or tamper with it once it had been delivered?" Mrs. Braithwaite swallowed. "Anyone in the house. The conservatory is near the back garden. The side path leads there too." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. And Mr. Lionel Webb, our theatrical critic, claims he was in the Blue Room. But there is no witness to this. No cup. No imprint. No record." Graves narrowed his eyes. "You think he never arrived in the Blue Room?" "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that he may have passed through the kitchen first." Poirot moved to a side table and produced a folded napkin, spotted faintly with a golden residue. "Recovered from the rubbish bin near the scullery. Cinnamon dust, laced with berberine. Whoever poisoned the spice did so without gloves, and later wiped their fingers." Graves leaned closer. "And whose prints?" Poirot smiled thinly. "We are waiting on confirmation, but I suspect, strongly, that Mr. Webb has a fondness for dramatics, and perhaps a darker understanding of stagecraft than he lets on." He turned back to Cecily. "For now, mademoiselle, your lie is noted, but your guilt is unproven." And then to the room at large. "But someone in this house used memory to kill, and memory, like spice, leaves behind its trace." He straightened, voice quiet, "And I intend to follow it." Chapter 6. The Shadow of Giles Edevane. The following day brought with it a dense drizzle, London's preferred form of silence. The streets glistened under grey skies, and a mood of suspended tension clung to Gainsborough Mews like moisture to the stone facades. Inside the Edevane townhouse, Hercule Poirot sat at the window in Miss Edevane's study, the same spot where she had likely penned her final thoughts. His gaze was fixed not on the rain, but on the echo left behind by an absence. Gilles Edevane. Poirot had not yet met the young man, and yet the outline of his presence had become uncomfortably vivid. A missing key, a vanished train passenger, a chain without its locket. Guilt, Poirot often said, leaves an indentation long before it leaves a confession. A sharp knock at the study door broke his reverie. Inspector Graves entered, coat damp, brows furrowed with that particular look of half triumph, half frustration. "We found him," he said without ceremony. Poirot rose. "Giles?" Graves nodded. He was spotted near Oxford, hiding at a friend's cottage under a false name. Claimed he was taking time to think. "We've brought him in. He's downstairs. Says he's innocent, naturally." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Let us see how a guilty man thinks when he believes himself to be clever. They descended to the drawing room, now converted into a makeshift interview space. Giles Edevane sat in one of the carved rosewood chairs, soaked through, looking every inch the dishevelled heir. His corduroy blazer was crumpled, his shirt collar wilted with sweat and rain. But what struck Poirot most was the look in his eyes. Not fear, not arrogance, but disappointment. "So," Giles said with a forced laugh as Poirot entered, "the famous Hercule Poirot, summoned like a ghost at a séance. Poirot approached without smiling. Mademoiselle Edevan was murdered. You fled the city within the hour. Forgive me if I do not find your metaphors amusing. Giles leaned back, tapping his fingers against the chair arm. I didn't kill her. That remains to be seen, Poirot said. But you did leave. Why? Giles hesitated, then leaned forward. Because I was supposed to be in that room when she died. She asked me to meet her in the conservatory at 10:30. But when I arrived, the door was locked. I knocked. No answer. I assumed she'd changed her mind. So I left. Where did you go? The park, Hyde Park. I sat near the Serpentine for an hour. Then I got nervous. I came back, saw a constable outside the house, and I panicked. Because you feared being blamed? Poirot asked. Because I would be blamed. My uncle left me out of the family trust, and Aunt Calpurnia held the reins. Everyone knew I needed the money. Ah, Poirot said softly. So you admit motive? Giles gave a bitter laugh. Motive, yes, but not method. I didn't poison her. I didn't even enter the house that morning. Graves crossed his arms. You were staying there, weren't you? For a few days. But she'd asked me to keep to the guest quarters. We barely spoke. Why? Poirot asked. Did something happen between you? Giles hesitated. She said I reminded her too much of her brother, my father, said I had the same eyes, the same arrogance. She hated that about him. Poirot tilted his head. What did she hate? The way he lied, Giles muttered. He made bad investments, gambled. She blamed him for their mother's death, said he sold her heirlooms to cover debts. She never forgave him. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Did you inherit anything from him? Just books, Giles said bitterly, and debts of my own. Did you know, Poirot said softly, that your aunt had drafted a new will last week? Giles blinked. Number. It is unsigned, but in it she reconsiders your exclusion. Giles froze. Are you saying she was going to change her mind? Poirot said nothing. I didn't know, Giles whispered. I swear, if I had. But someone did, Poirot murmured. There was a pause. Graves broke it. You left with her locket. I didn't steal it, Giles replied, suddenly defensive. She gave it to me a month ago. Said it belonged to my grandmother. I kept it in my bag. I didn't know the key was inside. Yet, you kept it on your person while discarding your luggage. I panicked, he repeated. I didn't think. Poirot stood very still, watching him. Did you love your aunt, monsieur? Giles blinked. What? Poirot's voice softened. It is a simple question. Giles faltered. Yes, I did. Even when she judged me. Even when she withheld everything. First period. I loved her because she was the last link to my family. Poirot studied him in silence, then turned to Graves. For now, let him remain in custody. But I do not believe, Inspector, that this young man administered the poison. Graves frowned. Because he loved her. No, Poirot replied. Because he regrets her death. He moved toward the door, but paused. Guilt often disguises itself as panic. But regret, true regret, it arrives only when something precious is lost. As he stepped into the hallway, Cecily Grant appeared, startled to see Poirot so near. She clutched a leather folio to her chest. What is that? Poirot asked. She hesitated, then handed it over. It was in Miss Edevane's private drawer. I found it after you left the study. It's personal. Poirot opened it slowly. Inside were pages and pages of handwritten reflections, culinary theories, emotional essays, and in the final section, a journal entry. I no longer trust my memory. Or perhaps I fear what it has chosen to forget. But the spice helps me remember. even if remembering kills me. Poirot closed the book gently. So, the victim had known her killer might come from the past. And now, Poirot thought, it was time to speak to the one guest who hadn't spoken at all. Mr. Lionel Webb, the man who always watched, but never reacted. The man who had the skill to hide a murder in plain sight, and the knowledge of how to stage it. Chapter 7. The Critic Who Stayed Too Long. Lionel Webb stood in the library like a man perpetually caught in a dress rehearsal, well-groomed, composed, but somehow never quite authentic. The room suited him, high-backed chairs, velvet drapes, and walls lined with titles that hinted at far more lives than had ever passed through the door. His arms were folded, gaze fixed on a glass case, housing a rare edition of Brillat-Savarin's Physiology of Taste, as if it might contain the answer to everything. Poirot entered without ceremony. Inspector Graves followed, notebook in hand, though it was clear Poirot would be conducting the performance. "You requested to speak with me again, Monsieur Poirot?" Lionel asked coolly. Poirot offered a small nod. "Indeed, monsieur, but allow me to clarify. I did not request. I insisted." Webb's eyebrows lifted. "Oh? You see," Poirot began, walking slowly around the edge of the room. "When a man claims to be alone in a room that no one can verify, at the exact time a murder takes place, that is what we call in polite society suspicious." "I told you," Lionel said, voice low. "I was in the blue drawing room, reading." Poirot stopped. "Reading what?" "A play manuscript, unpublished. I brought it with me." "Ah, yes," Poirot said, "and yet, when we searched the room, we found no such manuscript." Lionel hesitated. "I took it with me after. I didn't want it to be confused as evidence." "Curious," Poirot said mildly, "that a man so concerned with artistic integrity would tamper with a crime scene." "I didn't tamper," Lionel said sharply. "I simply didn't want to waste time being accused of something I didn't do." Poirot took another step closer. "And yet, Monsieur Webb, you have spent a great deal of time here since the death. You are not close family, not an employee, and yet you linger. Why?" Lionel's lips thinned. "I told you, Calpurnia was my friend." Poirot paused. "Were you in love with her?" That surprised him, the flicker in his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes. "No," he said slowly. "Admired, yes. Envious, perhaps. But love, that would have required reciprocity." "And yet," Poirot said, "you visited her nearly every week, dined with her, shared in her research." "Why?" Lionel's voice dropped. "Because she was the only person who understood that food is not simply nourishment. It is memory, ritual, narrative. I once asked her if she thought grief could be digested. She replied, 'Only if it's bitter enough to teach us.'" Poirot studied him. "Did she ever confide in you?" "A little. About her brother, her nephew, the inheritance, but only in fragments, never the whole." "Did she mention her new lecture, Gustatory Memory and Emotional Deception?" Webb nodded. "She told me it would be her last, her masterpiece." "And did she mention that she was revising her will?" That caught Lionel off guard. "No," he said quietly. "But I suppose I'm not surprised. She always planned to leave everything to the Culinary Institute." "Ah," Poirot said with a thin smile. "But she changed her mind. Giles was to be reintroduced. Her cousin, Honoria Pell, was to be removed. Even you, monsieur, were to be named as custodian of her unpublished works." Lionel stiffened. "You're lying." "I never lie," Poirot replied. "Only the guilty do." There was a tense silence. Graves shifted his weight, but said nothing. Poirot walked toward the nearby writing desk. He held up a photograph taken from the surface. It showed Calpurnia seated beside Lionel, both laughing over a platter of glazed figs. This was taken 4 months ago, at her summer salon, yes? She looks happy. She was, Lionel whispered. She said I helped. Her remember what art tasted like. Poirot placed the photograph down gently. And did she ever make you feel replaceable? Lionel didn't answer. Poirot turned, voice low but direct. Because she was moving on, monsieur. She was publishing new work, collaborating with a young assistant, reconsidering her family ties. You, monsieur, were being edited out. Lionel's eyes darkened. I didn't kill her, he said at last. Perhaps not with malice, Poirot replied, but with bitterness, and bitterness, you know, pairs exquisitely with almond. A beat passed. Poirot stepped closer. Let us speak then of the cinnamon. You see, the powder recovered from the teacup and the napkin both carried traces of berberine, a detail the killer assumed no one would understand. But Miss Edevane knew her spices. She would have tasted the falseness immediately, which is why I believe she did not drink the tea at all. Graves looked up. Then how did the poison enter her system? Poirot turned. The cake. Silence. Poirot opened a small box he had carried in with him. Inside was a delicate slice of almond sponge, recovered from the kitchen. Alongside it, a second, identical slice, but one with the faintest golden speckling across the icing. One was hers, Poirot said. The other found in the larder, untouched. You see, the killer prepared both, but made certain only one reached her plate. Webb licked his lips. I didn't. She had 2 guests she trusted that day, Poirot interrupted. Her assistant and you. Miss Grant brought the manuscript. You brought the cake. Webb faltered. She asked me to pick it up from a special bakery. Poirot nodded. Yes, but the bakery did not prepare it. They say you never arrived. Webb went quiet. Poirot's voice grew gentler. You knew her taste memory. You knew the associations, a hint of almond, her comfort, a dusting of cinnamon, her final contradiction. You orchestrated her death like a scene, a quiet monologue of remembrance and betrayal. Webb looked away. Poirot stepped back. But you see, monsieur, your problem was this. Memory does not obey the rules of theatre. It lingers, it stains, and it leaves behind contradictions too subtle for even the best actors to erase. Poirot turned to Graves. Inspector, I believe it is time to search Mr. Webb's apartment. I suspect we will find gloves, spice residue, and perhaps even a handwritten revision of a lecture he did not want the world to hear. As Graves moved to act, Poirot looked once more at Lionel Webb. No longer composed, no longer rehearsed. Just a man who had tried to rewrite the final act, only to discover the audience had not yet left their seats, and Hercule Poirot had never missed a performance. Chapter 8. The Memory That Vanished. It was past 9 o'clock that evening when Poirot returned to his temporary lodgings at the Majestic Hotel. The room was warm, richly carpeted, and steeped in a comforting quiet. Outside, the London rain had resumed, soft and consistent, drumming gently against the tall windows like the rhythm of a troubled thought. But Poirot was not at rest. He stood beside the fireplace, his small frame perfectly erect, fingers steepled as he considered the facts laid bare. Lionel Webb had not confessed, yet, but the evidence was tightening around him like a noose woven from performance and pride. Still, something in Poirot's mind refused to settle. Something did not fit. He moved to his writing desk and laid out his notes once again. Photographs, spice residue reports, witness statements, a copy of Calpurnia's draft lecture outline. And the curious journal entry now carefully retranscribed in his immaculate handwriting: I no longer trust my memory, or perhaps I fear what it has chosen to forget. But the spice helps me remember, even if remembering kills me. He read it aloud softly, eyes narrowing. The spice helps me remember. Not a spice, not spices. The spice. Singular. There was a knock at the door. Poirot opened it to find Inspector Graves, damp around the shoulders, but holding an envelope with purpose. We searched Webb's flat, he said grimly. Found the gloves. Found a bottle of powdered spice, labeled cinnamon, but lab confirms it contains traces of golden seal and yellow root, berberine. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Enough to kill? Easily. And the handwritten lecture revision? Graves shook his head. No such luck. Poirot accepted the envelope. Inside was a single photo, a younger Lionel Webb and Calpurnia Edevane standing beneath a banner that read, The Gastronomic Mind, Oxford Symposium, 1995. She was smiling. He was watching her, not the camera. They were closer than he admitted, Graves muttered. Poirot nodded. Closer, yes, but not intimate in the way he wanted. He adored her. Intellect. And like many men whose affection goes unreturned, he sought control through admiration. Graves sighed. We've enough for an arrest. The lab results, the cake, the gloves. We can bring him in properly tomorrow. Poirot did not smile. Then, may I ask, mon ami, why do I feel that we are being led in a dance? Graves blinked. You think he's not the killer? Poirot turned away, hands clasped behind his back. He had motive, yes. He had access, yes. He even had knowledge of how Calpurnia thought. But he is too deliberate. His crime is a mirror held up to himself, not to her. He turned sharply. Tell me, was anything missing from her house? Anything at all? A notebook? A bottle? An ingredient? Graves hesitated. Nothing reported. We logged everything. Poirot's brow furrowed. Then we must look for something that should have been there, but was not. He returned to the letter from Avignon, the unsigned note. You must forgive me eventually, or I'll never rest. Poirot whispered it aloud. Then he picked up the list of guests again. Guests who had been inside the house during the days leading to the murder. Mrs. Honoria Pell, Cecily Grant, Lionel Webb, Dr. Ellery, Giles. He underlined Dr. Ellery's name. Poirot had not interviewed the man since the initial statements, and yet Ellery had been in the house just before the body was found. A quiet arrival, a concerned tone. No one had questioned his access. A retired doctor, a friend of the family, a man with reason to visit, and knowledge of what berberine could do to a weakened heart. Poirot picked up the phone and rang Graves's office. Tell me, he said when the inspector answered, did Dr. Ellery ever sign the visitor's log? Number. He wasn't an official guest. He said Calpurnia invited him for a checkup. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Find out which university hospital he worked at, and check if he had any connection with the Avignon Medical Institute. He hung up and sat down, heart steady, mind racing. Because now a second possibility began to bloom. By morning, Graves returned with a file in hand, his expression grim. Ellery studied in Avignon in the early 1980s. Records show he shared a research grant with a woman named... He flipped through the folder. Madeleine Edevane. Poirot closed his eyes slowly. Calpurnia's mother. She would have been in her 60s by then, Graves added. Strange. No, Poirot said softly, not strange at all. Madeleine was a culinary psychologist. She returned to academia late in life. They must have collaborated, perhaps even been lovers, but something happened, a betrayal, a debt unpaid. Graves frowned. So you're saying Ellery poisoned Calpurnia because of something from her mother's past? Poirot stood, retrieving the spice jar from the evidence box. This jar was not simply symbolic. It was a relic from Madeleine's archive, and only one person in that house besides Calpurnia would have recognized its exact lineage. He handed the jar to Graves. Check the fingerprints. I suspect you'll find Ellery's beneath the victim's. Graves stared at it. You think he planted it? I think he reminded her, Poirot replied, of something long buried, something she could never forgive. Graves shook his head. So who do we arrest? Webb, with his gloves and his berberine, or Ellery, with no confession and a decades-old grudge? Poirot's voice was calm. Both men are liars, but only one is a murderer. He reached for his coat, his eyes distant. And the answer, Inspector, is waiting not in spice, but in memory, a memory Miss Edevane tried to forget, one hidden not in what she shared, but in what she never wrote down. He turned toward the door. It is time, he said, to return to the pantry, and to the spice that was never truly forgotten. Chapter 9. The Jar That Never Belonged. The pantry of 43 Gainsborough Mews was silent, almost reverent, like a museum without visitors. A faint trace of bergamot clung to the air, old, unrefreshed. The rows of glass jars stood untouched in their precise wooden slots, each one labelled in Calpurnia Edevane's hand. To the untrained eye, it was simply a spice archive. But to Hercule Poirot, it was a carefully coded autobiography, one of scents, origins, and secrets. He stood alone at the pantry threshold, gloved hands clasped behind his back. Inspector Graves waited nearby, but did not interrupt. Poirot's eyes moved methodically from shelf to shelf, reabsorbing each detail. The curvature of the labels, the calligraphy, the faint dust halos around rarely moved jars. Then, with sudden certainty, he reached out, not for the missing cinnamomum verum jar, but for the slot beside it. Here, Poirot said quietly. This is where the contradiction begins. Graves moved closer. That's the slot we noted was empty. The cinnamon jar was found in her hand. So? Poirot nodded. Oui, but what should have been here was not cinnamon. He knelt down and pointed at the carved wooden label inlaid into the shelf. It read, Bergera Königii, curry leaf. Miss Edevane kept her spices in taxonomic order. Look here, oakum basilicum on the left, basil, Bergera Königii next, curry leaf. And yet, the cinnamon jar was discovered in this slot instead. Graves frowned. So the cinnamon was placed here deliberately? Exactly, to make it appear that she had removed it herself, Poirot said. But more than that, it replaced another spice, one not associated with remembrance but with exposure. He stood. Curry leaf is mild, delicate, but it changes aroma when heated. Had she intended to use it for her lecture, it would have been noticed, especially by anyone who knew what she was preparing. Graves tilted his head. You think she was going to use that spice instead? I think, Poirot replied, that someone realized she was about to change her message, and they panicked. Poirot turned, walking toward the far end of the pantry, where a small, antique writing desk sat beneath a window. Miss Edevane often journaled there, surrounded by mortar, pestle, and memory. She had planned a final lecture, Poirot said softly, but not the one she originally wrote. The revised notes, now missing, were created here, not in the attic. This was her true workshop. He opened the drawer slowly. Inside, nestled among recipe clippings and handwritten musings, was a small, age-stained envelope. Poirot lifted it gently. On the front, in delicate, almost trembling script, to be read if I am silenced. Graves leaned in. Well, that's ominous. Poirot unfolded the note. The ink was smudged in parts, but legible. He read aloud, "If this reaches you after my death, know that I did not die by accident. I have felt eyes on me for weeks, old eyes, full of disappointment. I unearthed something in my research, a betrayal not of science, but of memory. And memory, once stirred, demands vengeance. I believe someone fears what I am about to reveal. They want the past buried again, but I will not allow it." She had signed it with only her initials. C. Poirot folded the note and turned to Graves. She knew. She anticipated the attack. Not from Webb. He was merely an opportunist, angry at her distance, and not from her cousin or the assistant, whose lies concealed petty grievances but not violence. Graves asked quietly, "Then who?" Poirot's face was grave. "Dr. Ellery." Graves nodded slowly. "We checked his records. He studied in Avignon with Madeleine Edevane. The timeline fits, but there's no public scandal." "There would not be," Poirot said. "He was careful. But I believe Calpurnia, in uncovering her mother's correspondence and notes, perhaps through those very spice jars, found evidence that Ellery had falsified their joint research. Or worse." Graves frowned. "You think he discredited Madeleine?" "Or ruined her," Poirot said. "Perhaps he stole her conclusions, or perhaps he exposed something personal. Either way, Calpurnia sought to bring the truth to light through metaphor, through the language she trusted most." "Spice," Graves said, understanding dawning. Poirot nodded. "Yes, but her metaphor was silenced before it could be spoken." There was a knock at the pantry door. Constable Bell entered, flushed and damp from the rain. "Sir," he said to Graves, "we've just received the lab analysis on the spice jar. There's something odd." Graves raised a brow. "Go on." Bell handed him a report. There were 2 distinct sets of fingerprints, Calpurnia's and Dr. Ellery's, but more importantly, the jar wasn't authentic. It's a replica, modern. Poirot's eyes lit up. "A reproduction?" Bell nodded. "From a private collector in Dorset, sold online last year." Graves turned to Poirot. "So the jar didn't come from her archive?" "No," Poirot murmured. "It was planted, meant to look familiar, to deceive her." He stepped back. She would have recognized the difference immediately, which is why the poison needed to act fast. The moment she tasted the fake spice, she would know something was wrong, but by then it would be too late. Poirot turned to Graves, his voice calm but resolute. "We must find Dr. Ellery, not as a guest, not as a friend, but as a man who forged memory to protect a lie." Graves was already moving. "I'll issue a warrant." Poirot remained in the pantry, gazing at the spice jars in their silent rows. It was not cinnamon, he whispered to himself. It was fear, ground, powdered, and served in disguise. Then, without another word, he gently closed the drawer containing Calpurnia's final note, and the memory she had died to preserve. Chapter 10. A Prescription for Silence. The morning after Poirot discovered Calpurnia Edevane's hidden letter, London's fog thickened like gauze over a wound, blurring rooftops and softening the corners of the world. The city seemed to hold its breath, and so did Hercule Poirot, as he stepped from the cab onto the slick cobblestones of Gable Row. Number 27 was a modest red brick house nestled among ivy-draped townhomes. Its brass knocker gleamed unnaturally clean. Dr. Ellery's residence. Poirot adjusted his gloves and turned to Inspector Graves, who had just arrived with two uniformed officers. Graves was unusually quiet. "No sign of activity inside," he murmured. Curtains drawn. No answer to repeated knocks. And no one's seen him leave since the day after the murder. Poirot nodded. "Then we must assume he knows the net is tightening." Graves signalled the constables. "Proceed." The door was opened within minutes. The interior was dark, silent and meticulously kept. Framed anatomical sketches adorned the walls. Glass apothecary jars lined the shelves, ginger root, valerian, wormwood. But one jar sat empty. Poirot approached it and read the label. Hydrastis canadensis, golden seal root. Graves exhaled. "There's our berberine." Poirot moved to the desk in the adjoining study, scanning it with surgical precision. A patient journal lay open to an entry dated 3 weeks prior. Beneath the neat penmanship were the words, "Patient C. Edivane." Diagnosis, stress-induced insomnia. Prescription, herbal sedative, non-synthetic. Administer only under supervision. "An herbal sedative?" Graves repeated, reading over Poirot's shoulder. "What kind?" Poirot tapped the page. He would never write it explicitly, but if I'm not mistaken, he created a blend, one laced with berberine, enough to cause cardiac stress under the right conditions. He moved to the small cabinet behind the desk, a locked compartment. Graves retrieved a key from the drawer, standard issue. Inside were sealed paper packets, labelled by date. One was marked, Edivane, final mix. Poirot opened it carefully. The scent was sharp, woody, with a bitter undertone. "Mixed herbs," Poirot said. "But this is not a sedative. This is a weapon in a teacup." A noise interrupted them. From upstairs, the faint shift of a floorboard. Graves signalled silently. One officer moved ahead. Poirot remained still. Then the voice came. "I'm not running." They turned. At the foot of the stairs stood Dr. Ellery, older than his years, dressed in a dressing gown, eyes calm. He held no weapon, just a file in his hands. "Sit down," Graves ordered. Ellery descended slowly, almost with dignity. "I thought you'd be here sooner." Poirot stepped forward. "You poisoned her." "No," Ellery said softly. "I reminded her." He placed the file on the table between them. She already knew. Graves opened it. Letters, transcripts, and a photo of a young Madeleine Edivane seated beside a much younger Ellery, both beaming in a laboratory. "She was my mentor," Ellery said. "Brilliant, passionate, but deeply unstable in her final years. She claimed that memory was a physical organ subject to decay and theft. She believed taste could preserve it. She grew paranoid, obsessed." "And you?" Poirot asked. "I loved her," Ellery said simply. "I tried to help her, but she accused me of stealing her research. She was wrong. I took nothing that wasn't mine, but she told Calpurnia otherwise, planted the idea that I had betrayed them both, and Calpurnia never forgot." "Nor forgave," Poirot murmured. "No," Ellery agreed. "Not even after 30 years. She invited me back into her life only so she could humiliate me in front of the academic world. That lecture, it wasn't about spice. It was about revenge." Poirot stepped closer. "So you silenced her?" Ellery shook his head. "I gave her something to help her sleep, the same blend I always did. But I knew, if she took it with her usual tea, if her heart was already strained, it might not end well. I did not force her." "That is a coward's defense," Poirot said coldly. "You gave her the cup, knowing it might be her last." Ellery met his gaze. "She wanted to remember, and she did. That's what frightens you, Poirot, isn't it? That she knew the truth, and chose to die with it. Graves nodded to the officers. "Take him." As they led Ellery out, Poirot lingered behind. He moved back to the patient journal. On a blank page near the back, he saw something faint, barely legible until he tilted it toward the light. A single line, written in almost invisible ink. "I will be remembered. But not for how I died." Poirot closed the book. Outside, the fog was lifting, but inside the house of a man who had once confused remembrance for redemption, the air would never fully clear, not of bitterness, not of guilt, and certainly not of spice. Poirot turned to Graves. "This was not a crime of passion," he said. "It was a crime of memory. And memory, mon ami, is the cruelest witness of all." Chapter 11. The silence that was promised. 2 days passed. London returned to its rhythm, the engines, the papers, the clatter of spoons on porcelain in hotel tea-rooms. But for Hercule Poirot, time remained suspended in the amber of unresolved thought. Dr. Ellery had been formally charged with involuntary manslaughter, and Lionel Webb was released from custody, his own actions condemned only by ethics, not law. Still, Poirot could not rest. He sat in the library of 43 Gainsborough Mews, the house now dormant, uninhabited save for dust and echoes. Graves had completed his formal investigation and returned to Scotland Yard. Cecily Grant had gone home. Honoria Pell had left in a rage, muttering about legal appeals. And Giles, perhaps the most wounded of them all, had departed without speaking a word to Poirot. But something still pulled at the detective's sense of order. It was not that the solution had gaps. On the contrary, every piece had found its place. It was that the pattern was too neat. Poirot ran his hand along the spine of the gastronomic mind, then turned back to Calpurnia's writing desk. A single, sealed envelope remained atop it, one he had not opened. It was addressed simply to G.E. Gilles Edevin. Poirot hesitated, then opened it, not from curiosity, but necessity. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Giles, I've come to understand something about bitterness. It doesn't start in the mouth. It starts in the memory. I held on to anger for so long that I forgot why it began. Only when I looked back, really looked, did I see what I had done to you, to your father, and to myself. I was wrong to cut you off. I let grief make me cruel. You were a boy when your father failed us, but I treated you like the man who had caused the harm. That is a mistake I will not let history repeat. There is a key in the locket. It opens the study drawer. In it you'll find a revised will. Signed, witnessed. Yours is not a gift. It is an apology." Calpurnia, Poirot's breath caught. He had not seen a signed will. The version Graves recovered was a draft. He rose instantly and moved to the study. The locket, the key, the drawer. Inside was a leather folder, almost invisible beneath sheets of travel brochures. He removed it carefully. The revised will, 2 witnesses, her full signature, dated 5 days before her death, and legally binding. Poirot's mind raced. This changed everything. Calpurnia had not merely considered reinstating Giles. She had done it. The motive for murder had doubled in magnitude. Whoever wanted to silence her did not simply want to keep a secret buried. They wanted to stop that will. He turned, heart thudding softly beneath his waistcoat. Someone else had known. Someone in the house who had gone unnoticed, unhindered and unseen, because their presence had never been questioned. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Braithwaite. She had claimed to be outside polishing the railings. She was the one who brought the tea. She was the one who had found the body and the spice jar, already placed. No one ever asked where she was in the minutes before death, because no one questions the furniture. Poirot moved swiftly to the back kitchen, where she had taken up temporary residence while the estate waited to be closed. She was there, placing her coat on the hook, eyes widening at the sight of him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I didn't expect you—" "Non, madame," he said gently. "But perhaps I should have." She stilled. "I have found the signed will," Poirot said. "It was in the drawer you claimed was always locked." She looked away. "You knew Giles had been reinstated," Poirot continued, "and that meant you would lose control of the estate, the house, your position." Her voice, when it came, was dry as overbaked bread. "I gave her 23 years. I ran this place like it was a cathedral. And then he returns, that boy, the one who never even wrote to her. You thought yourself the rightful heir. I was. She said she'd leave it to the Institute, but she kept everything in my name. Every account, every drawer. She couldn't run the house without me." Poirot's voice dropped. "And when she changed her mind?" "She told me to bring her the special blend. Said she was too tired to sleep. I made the tea. I even placed the cinnamon jar where she'd find it, because she liked the comfort of it." Poirot studied her. "But the berberine—" "I didn't know it would kill her," she snapped. "Not really. I thought it would slow her down, make her miss the lecture, give me time to convince her. But then she drank it too fast." Poirot said nothing. The silence was thick. "And then you found her," he said softly. She nodded. I panicked, put the jar in her hand, removed the other cup, wiped everything. She'd just finished writing the letter to Giles. Poirot's voice was soft, but steel beneath silk. "And the will?" She hesitated. "I left it. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it." "Why not?" She stared at him. "Because part of me hoped he'd find it, that he'd take this place seriously, that someone would." Poirot's voice was nearly a whisper. "You killed her." Mrs. Braithwaite looked down at her hands, now trembling. "I never meant to." But meaning, Poirot knew, was a poor companion to consequence. As he left the kitchen, he carried the will in his coat pocket and the letter to Giles in his hand. A crime, he thought, was not always born from hatred. Sometimes it was born from being forgotten. But memory, like cinnamon, always lingered in the air, sweet, bitter, and impossible to wash away. Chapter 12. The Will That Waited. The envelope trembled slightly in Poirot's gloved hands as he made his way up the stairwell of the modest Bloomsbury boarding house. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish and pipe smoke. Room 3B was at the end, its door ajar, a small suitcase just inside, half-packed. He knocked once, then entered gently. Giles Edevane was standing by the window, looking out at the overcast city with a resignation that no longer belonged to youth. His reflection in the glass seemed older than the man himself, haunted, perhaps, by absences too long endured. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Giles said without turning. "I had no intention to at first," Poirot replied, closing the door behind him. "But there is a truth that must be handed to you, one that waited too long already." Giles turned. "Did she leave anything for me?" Poirot nodded. He held out the envelope first, addressed in Calpurnia's unmistakable hand. Giles took it with slow reverence, then opened it. The silence was heavy as he read the letter, once, twice. When he looked up, his voice cracked slightly. She knew. All this time she knew what she'd done to me, and she still waited until the end. Poirot did not answer. Instead, he laid the leather folder on the table. "The revised will," he said. "Signed, witnessed, You are the rightful heir to 43 Gainsborough Mews and the Edivane Trust, her estate, her legacy. Giles stared at it, unmoving. Poirot studied him. Does this bring you comfort, monsieur? Gilles exhaled. I thought it would. But now, I feel like a man inheriting a house built on firewood. Poirot stepped forward. Mademoiselle Edivane was many things, brilliant, exacting, proud, but she was also a woman wrestling with memory, and memory, as I have come to understand, leaves no tidy ledger. Giles shook his head. She was always one step ahead of me. Even when I was a boy, she'd tell me stories with the endings hidden, only to ask what I'd learned afterward. I hated it. I never knew what was expected. She wanted you to think, Poirot said softly. And that is a rare kind of gift, monsieur, even if it comes wrapped in difficulty. Giles looked down at the will again. What happens now? Poirot sat across from him. Mrs. Braithwaite has confessed to administering the blend that led to her death. She will face charges, though likely not for murder. Involuntary manslaughter, perhaps. Her grief twisted into a possessive kind of love. And Ellery? Giles asked. He remains in custody, for his own reasons. His deception began long ago with your grandmother, but the chain of betrayal led directly into your aunt's hands. He will be held accountable. Giles was quiet, then softly, I don't want the house. Poirot tilted his head. No? Giles rose and walked to the suitcase. It feels like a mausoleum. Every room lined with judgment. She left me the structure, yes, but the warmth. She gave that to her memories, not her nephew. He turned. Do you think that's wrong of me? Poirot shook his head gently. No, monsieur. It is honest. And honesty is the only inheritance worth more than gold. Giles looked down again at the letter. Still, I want to preserve what she built. Not the house, but the archive, the spice library, the research. She wanted people to understand how flavor links to truth. And I think, somewhere inside, I finally do. Poirot allowed himself a small smile. Then her death is not the end of her legacy. Giles met his gaze. It never is it? No, Poirot said. When we speak of those who shaped us, even in pain, we bring them back into the world. That is what remembrance truly is. Not a shrine, but a conversation. There was a long pause, soft with rain against the glass. Then Giles asked, Did she ever say anything else? Anything to you? Poirot hesitated. Then, from the inner pocket of his coat, he produced a small card. One of Calpurnia's lecture note cards, water-stained but legible. He handed it over. Giles read it aloud. True cinnamon tastes like truth, but only when sprinkled carefully. Too much, and all nuance is lost. He smiled sadly. Still teaching. Poirot stood. Always. As he made to leave, Giles called out, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot turned. Do you ever forget the cases, the people? Poirot considered this. I forget the noise, the distractions, but never the face of grief, or guilt, or grace. These things remain, tucked in, the folds of the mind, like spice in the lining of a well-worn coat. He tipped his hat and stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. London exhaled. Somewhere, a cafe door opened. The scent of nutmeg and coffee drifted into the street, and far behind him, in a quiet boarding room, a young man unfolded a legacy that had waited not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Chapter 13. The Witness Who Forgot to Leave. The week following the arrest of Mrs. Braithwaite unfolded with a curious hush. Though newspapers reported the case in terms of inheritance, poisoning, and the eccentricity of culinary scholars, the true complexity of the matter remained hidden from public view. The headlines were shallow. But Poirot knew that what had taken place within the ivy-covered walls of 43 Gainsborough Mews was more than a crime. It was a performance of remembrance, curated and destroyed by those who could not endure the truths memory insisted on preserving. Yet despite the legal resolution, one final thread pulled at Poirot's mind. Not guilt, not grief, but timing. He found himself once again at Gainsborough Mews, standing in the conservatory where Calpurnia Edavan had died, teacup undrunk, cake untouched, spice jar too deliberately placed in her limp hand. The light streamed weakly through the glass roof, casting soft shadows over the velvet armchair where death had made its quiet entrance. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He had been satisfied, hadn't he? The blend had been traced. The locket's key led to the signed will. Mrs. Braithwaite's confession aligned with the chain of events. Ellery's deception was unearthed, even if it had not resulted in direct violence. And yet... Poirot turned as the door creaked. Inspector Graves entered, shrugging off his coat. "You do realize you've solved the case?" Graves said with a small huff. "Multiple times, in fact. Why come back?" Poirot did not smile. "Because, mon ami, something is missing. A piece that was in the room. And then was not." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Another object? A presence?" Graves frowned. "Webb. He's gone. Fled the city. Wrote some dreadful column about how memory is the most dangerous playwright." "Not Webb," Poirot said. "Cecily Grant." Graves blinked. She was cleared. Poirot nodded. "She was not the killer, but she knows more than she told us, and I believe she was in this room at a time she claimed she was elsewhere." "You think she saw it happen?" "No," Poirot said. "I think she saw something immediately after the death, and made a choice not to speak." He stepped over to the tea tray, now cold and long untouched, preserved for evidence. Poirot crouched down beside it, then rose again, satisfied. "I shall call upon her now," he said. Graves sighed. "You don't stop, do you?" Poirot's voice was quiet. "One does not stop when truth remains slightly ajar." Cecily Grant's flat was on the second floor of a narrow brick building near Fitzrovia, modest and book-laden, with faded curtains and a scent of jasmine that had long since lost its bloom. She answered the door herself, pale, dressed in charcoal grey, and noticeably thinner than the last time Poirot had seen her. "You're here about the house," she said flatly. "About you," Poirot corrected. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, papers littered the table, lecture notes, sketches, a half-drafted proposal titled "The Psychology of Palate, Mourning Through Taste." Poirot noticed. She saw that he had. "I wasn't trying to steal her work," she said. I didn't want it to be lost." Poirot nodded. "You cared for her deeply." Cecily exhaled, then sat down. She was everything I admired and everything I feared I'd become. Brilliant, uncompromising, isolated. Poirot sat opposite her. "I'm not here to accuse you, mademoiselle, but I must ask you plainly. Did you return to the conservatory after the housekeeper delivered the tea?" Cecily looked up, startled. "What?" "I believe you were nearby. Perhaps you saw her, already slumped in the chair. Perhaps you realized something was wrong." "I didn't—" She paused. "I did go down the main stairs early. I wanted to ask her if I could include a reference to the Persian mourning ritual in the appendix. But when I saw her through the glass, she was already. Still, I thought she'd fallen asleep. I didn't know." Poirot said nothing. "I didn't touch anything," she continued. "But I noticed the spice jar. I thought it was odd that she'd used one of the archival jars. That was unlike her. And then I panicked. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be part of another scandal, so I turned away. You lied about being in the attic. She looked ashamed. Yes. Poirot leaned forward. But you didn't just panic. You saw something else, didn't you? Cecily's eyes flickered. Poirot's voice dropped. You saw Mrs. Braithwaite enter the room after Calpurnia was already dead. Silence. Then, yes. Poirot sat back. She carried a cloth in her hand. I think she wiped the tray, Cecily whispered. She was crying, but very quiet. She didn't see me. I was on the stairwell. And yet you said nothing. She'd given her whole life to Calpurnia, Cecily murmured. They weren't employer and servant. They were two halves of a system. I didn't want to be the one to shatter that. I didn't know she had poisoned her. I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe she was just cleaning up. Poirot nodded slowly. I understand. He stood. Will you tell the court? She asked. Poirot paused at the door. That is not for me to decide. But if you wish to honour Mademoiselle Edevan's legacy, tell the truth. It is the only flavour that does not sour with time. Cecily blinked tears away. She would have hated me. No, Poirot said. She would have understood. You preserved the work she was too proud to share, and you saw what others could not admit. That is not betrayal. That is remembrance. He tipped his hat and stepped into the cold evening. Behind him, a young woman sat alone with a choice, and around them both, memory whispered, not as a spice now, but as a voice, quiet, exacting, and unrelenting. Chapter 14. The Taste of Unspoken Truth. It was a curious thing, Hercule Poirot thought, how a case could be resolved in the eyes of the law, but remain unsettled in the corners of the heart. The morning was grey, the sky pressed low over the city, and yet something in his step felt lighter, perhaps because truth, like a long-steeped tea, had finally begun to reveal its strength. He sat now in the lounge of the majestic hotel, sipping a tisane of lemon balm and fennel, his taste newly sharpened by weeks of association with Calpurnia Edevane's obsession, the emotional weight of flavour. He reflected on Cecily Grant's confession, the image of her on the stairwell, watching Mrs. Braithwaite tamper with a scene already weighted by death. Truth, Poirot knew, was not only a matter of guilt or innocence. It was also a matter of timing, of when people chose to speak and when they chose to let silence ferment. His musings were interrupted by the arrival of Giles Edevane. The young man had requested a private meeting that morning. He entered the lounge hesitantly, dressed more sharply than usual, still with the posture of someone uncertain of the space he was allowed to occupy. "Thank you for coming," Giles said, settling into the chair across from Poirot. "You are the heir now," Poirot said. "People must come to you, monsieur." Giles offered a smile, faint but genuine. "I haven't decided what to do with the house yet." Poirot raised a brow. "You spoke of preserving her work. Has that changed?" "No," Giles said. "But I've been thinking about what it means to inherit something built on grief. The spices, the lectures, the notes, they were all filtered through memory she couldn't let go of." Poirot nodded. "And memory, when it becomes a prison, cannot serve the living." Giles looked down. "I found something in her bedroom, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, another notebook." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "She wrote it in the weeks before she died, a kind of personal log, half reflections, half confessions. There's a passage I wanted to show you." Giles pulled a folded page from his coat and handed it across. Poirot unfolded it delicately. "There is a flavour I have never recreated. It haunts me, not because of its taste, but because of its absence. My mother once described it as the moment a truth is known too late to act upon. She called it the spice of regret. I believe I have found it now. In Giles's eyes, I see what I have done, and what I can never undo. Poirot read the lines twice. He folded the paper carefully. She was not an unfeeling woman, he said at last, but she was a precise one, and precision is not always the same as kindness. I don't know if I can forgive her, Giles murmured, but I do think I can understand her now. Poirot's voice softened. That, monsieur, is often the harder choice, and the more courageous one. They sat in silence for a moment as the soft clink of cutlery and murmur of breakfast conversation surrounded them. There's something else, Giles said. I've spoken to Cecily. Poirot looked up. She's agreed to curate the Spice Archive, properly, publicly, as a research project, not a shrine. She wants it to be something that others can learn from, not just admire. Poirot smiled. Then you are already fulfilling her legacy more wisely than she might have imagined. Giles hesitated. I also asked her something else, something selfish. Poirot tilted his head. Ah? I asked her to help me identify what was missing from my father's story. She said Calpurnia kept files, records, maybe even letters she never showed anyone. Poirot steepled his fingers. And you believe there is still something left to uncover? I don't know, Giles admitted. But there's this feeling I can't shake, that everything I thought I knew about my family was a version told to protect me or punish me, never to teach me. Poirot looked out the window at the slow movement of clouds. Families are strange institutions, monsieur. We inherit not only names and assets, but silences, and those are harder to catalogue than any spice jar. A waiter approached to refill their tea. Poirot gestured that he would take no more. Giles rose, tucking the notebook page into his pocket. I wanted to thank you, he said, not just for solving the case, but for treating her memory like it mattered. Poirot stood as well. Every mystery is a story, monsieur, and every story, in the end, demands dignity. As Gilles departed, Poirot lingered by the window. Outside, the fog had begun to lift from the street. Carriages and cars moved more visibly. People began to reappear as distinct shapes rather than shadows. And Poirot, at last, felt the case settle. Not like a slammed door, but like a spice dissolving slowly in water, changing it irreversibly without a trace. He would file his final notes that evening. But first, he had one more visit to make, to the woman whose silence had lingered the longest, to Mrs. Honoria Pell. Chapter 15. The Cousin with the Empty Frame. Mrs. Honoria Pell lived in a stately townhouse in Kensington, 3 floors of order and lace, the kind of place where the carpet always looked vacuumed and the windows never needed opening. Hercule Poirot arrived precisely at noon, as was polite. The door was opened not by a maid, but by Mrs. Pell herself, dressed in a dove-grey blouse and a hat with a black silk ribbon, though she clearly had no intention of going anywhere. I suppose you've come to tell me I've been left nothing, she said with a stiff smile. Very well. Come in. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, madame. I would like a moment of your time, yes, but not to discuss the will. They stepped into her drawing room, a space that felt not lived in but preserved. The furniture was arranged with geometric precision. The fireplace was decorative only. On one table sat a single framed photograph of a much younger Honoria and Calpurnia, seated beside a man Poirot immediately recognized from previous pictures. Calpurnia's brother, Giles's father. Mrs. Pell followed his gaze. Yes, that's the only photograph of the three of us together. It was taken before everything fell apart. Poirot said nothing. She poured herself a cup of tea from a floral porcelain set, not offering any to him. I read about Mrs. Braithwaite's arrest, she said, voice tight. I assume you feel satisfied now, and Giles will inherit everything, of course, because the universe simply adores the reckless. Poirot remained still. The signed will was found. There is no contest, madame. No, there wouldn't be, she snapped. Calpurnia always played the long game. She wrote people off like debts. But I wonder, did she ever mention me in her final days? Did she say why I was being erased? Poirot stepped forward. Madame, may I ask, when was the last time you and she spoke privately? Mrs. Pell's eyes narrowed. About a month before she died. She asked me to come by, said she wanted to discuss the family trust. And how did the conversation go? She told me she was revising everything, that Giles might be brought back in. I tried to remind her of what he was, but she had that faraway look, like she was watching something through a window no one else could see. I left in a fury. Did you threaten her? Her eyes flashed. I don't need to make threats, monsieur. Calpurnia knew exactly what she owed me. Poirot lowered his voice. Did she owe you money? Mrs. Pell hesitated. No, she said finally. Something deeper. Something she never paid. Poirot waited. Silence like a held breath stretched between them. She owed me history, Mrs. Pell said softly. My side of it. My place in it. When her brother, Giles' father, left us in disgrace, she rewrote the family story, made it all about herself. She cast me as the foolish cousin, the hanger-on. She shut me out of the institute, out of the foundation. And when I asked to be included in the lecture series, just a footnote even, she said no. Poirot studied her face. Did she ever explain why? Mrs. Pell nodded bitterly. She said memory had to be tidy, that I was a complication, too many emotions, too many feelings she didn't want to account for. Poirot's expression softened, but his voice remained pointed. And yet you were in the house the morning she died. I was, Mrs. Pell said flatly. I waited downstairs for over 20 minutes. She never came to see me. The maid told me to wait. Then all that chaos, people shouting. I didn't even know she was dead until the constable told me. Did you see anyone suspicious? Number. Only Webb, creeping about like a theatre ghost. And Cecily, pale as wax. But I didn't speak to them. Poirot nodded slowly. Madame, he said after a pause, there is something you should know. He removed a small sealed envelope from his coat pocket. This was in Miss Ediven's private desk, addressed to you. Mrs. Pell looked startled, then reached for it with trembling hands. She opened it with a silver letter opener and read silently. Tears sprang to her eyes, though she blinked them back with effort. Poirot waited. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. She did remember. All of it. She even mentioned the time I cooked for her after her mother died. That dish with saffron and milk. She said she'd never forgotten the taste. Poirot gave her a moment. I think, he said gently, she could not say these things aloud. She needed the written word to bridge the years. Mrs. Pell nodded slowly, her composure crumbling at the edges. Does anyone else know about this letter? She asked. No, Poirot said, but if you wish, it could be included in the family archive. She shook her head. Number. Let this remain just between her and me. Let that be the last flavour we share. Poirot inclined his head. As you wish, madame. He turned to go, but paused. One last question, if I may. Yes? When you saw the spice jar in her hand, did anything strike you as false? Mrs. Pell blinked. I didn't see the jar. I never went into the conservatory. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Ah, he said softly, because only someone inside the conservatory, before the police arrived, would know about the cinnamon jar in her hand. And Mrs. Pell had just claimed she never entered. Poirot left the house, his steps slower than usual. One more contradiction. One more note in a chord already trembling with unresolved tension. This case, he thought, was not over. Not quite. Chapter 16. The fragrance left behind. The rain had returned by evening, thin and whispering, threading the city's edges with grey. Poirot sat alone in his suite at the majestic hotel, beneath the glow of a single lamp. On the table before him lay 2 envelopes. One bore the Edevane family crest and had been slit open with care. The other, smaller, unsealed and still blank, sat waiting for words Poirot had not yet decided to write. He tapped the tip of his pen gently against the desk. Mrs. Honoria Pell's contradiction was not just a slip, it was a fracture. A woman so precise, so concerned with dignity, had let something slip not because she was careless, but because she had forgotten the lie she told. Or because it was no longer a lie. She had entered the conservatory, which meant she saw the body, which meant she saw the jar, and said nothing. The phone on the writing desk rang, its bell crisp. Poirot, he answered. It was Inspector Graves. Thought you'd like to know, we got the finalized forensic report on the cinnamon jar. You were right about the replica. But there's something more. Poirot leaned forward. Yes? The inner lip of the jar's lid had a fingerprint. Just one. Braithwaite's prints were on the outside, but this one was inside, under the glaze lip. Almost missed it. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And it's Honoria Pell's. Poirot said nothing for a long beat, then softly, Merci, Inspector. That is what I needed. He replaced the receiver and rose. By midnight, he stood once more at the gates of 43 Gainsborough Mews. The house was dark. The police had sealed the pantry and conservatory, but Poirot did not need entry to complete his understanding. He needed only memory and timing. He traced the morning of the crime again in his mind, step by step, each arrival, each departure, the blue room, the conservatory, the kitchen, the scream, and in the shadows, unaccounted for, Mrs. Pell. She had claimed she waited downstairs. Braithwaite had said she was polishing brass. Cecily had watched, terrified, from the stairwell. But only one person had moved between rooms with complete invisibility, shielded not by stealth, but by social expectation. Who would question the older cousin who had always hovered, never quite fitting into the central family narrative? And who, Poirot thought, might have realized, on the morning of Calpurnia's death, that her name had been removed from the legacy she believed she was owed. It was not jealousy alone that moved Mrs. Pell. It was erasure. The next morning, Poirot arrived at Scotland Yard with a simple request. By early afternoon, he stood once more in a private interview room across from Mrs. Pell, invited on the pretext of clarifying witness inconsistencies. She wore the same grey blouse, the same hat. Her gloves were pristine. He sat down across from her and placed 3 items on the table: a photograph of the spice jar, a copy of Calpurnia's revised will, and the fingerprint report. Mrs. Pell's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Poirot began quietly. You loved her, didn't you? A long silence. Then, yes. But she never saw you clearly. Mrs. Pell's jaw stiffened. Number, she took your loyalty for granted, made you the repository of her bitterness, but never its heir. Mrs. Pell glanced at the items before her. Her fingers twitched just once, then settled. Poirot continued. You found the revised will on the morning of her death. You saw it on her desk, or in the drawer. You knew then she was going to erase you. Forever. Mrs. Pell whispered. She already had. And yet, Poirot said softly, you still brought her the tea. Now she looked up. That wasn't me. Poirot's gaze held hers. Number but the cinnamon jar. That was you. The jar you replaced. The one whose lid bears only your fingerprint inside. It was meant to be a message, wasn't it? Something she would notice. A warning. Mrs. Pell's voice cracked. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak. I left the jar there thinking, maybe she'd understand, that I knew what she was doing, that I deserved a voice. Poirot's voice softened. You didn't intend to kill her. No, she whispered. I just wanted her to feel remembered, like I existed again, like she couldn't cut me out with a signature and a lock. Poirot was silent. Mrs. Pell closed her eyes. But she didn't drink the tea, and still she died. And when the scream came, I panicked. I went back in. I saw the housekeeper near the body, weeping. I saw the jar in Calpurnia's hand, and I realized I could say nothing, and no one would ask. Poirot nodded slowly. Because you had never truly been in the picture to begin with. Mrs. Pell opened her eyes. I didn't poison her, but I let the story remain twisted. I let it hang because for once, it didn't cut me out. Poirot stood, his expression unreadable. I will not press charges, he said. What you did, planting the jar, leaving the scene, it was cruel, but the law has already spoken. The death was caused by Braithwaite's blend, not your theatre. Mrs. Pell said nothing. But remember this, madame, Poirot said as he turned to leave. Memory has many flavours, and the one that lingers longest is not always the one we wish to keep. He paused at the threshold. She left you a letter, he said. She did not erase you. Then he left her alone at last, in a room filled with everything she had wanted, recognition, inclusion, and consequence, and the faint, unshakable trace of cinnamon still clinging to her gloves. Chapter 17. The Archive That Breathed Again. A fortnight later, the dust had begun to settle, though not entirely. In matters of the heart, Poirot had often observed, justice brought resolution, but not always peace. Still, the truth, layered, bitter, fragile, had been uncovered, and that, in his mind, was its own form of mercy. Now he stood in the great vaulted hall of the Edivane Culinary Institute, just a mile north of Hampstead Heath. A large banner hung from the rafters, crisp and elegant, in deep maroon, the Edivane Archive of Taste, Memory and Psychology, curated by Cecily Grant and Giles Edivane. Below the banner, glass display cases shimmered beneath golden lights. Inside them, the carefully catalogued remnants of Calpurnia Edivane's life, a copper mortar and pestle, ancient spice scrolls from Persia and Morocco, annotated pages of her final lecture draft, and in the centre, a locked clear chamber containing the original Forgotten Flavours collection. 11 jars. One still missing. The 12th, Cinnamomum verum, would never be returned. Not because of evidence protocol, Poirot reflected, but because it had become something else entirely. A symbol, a threshold. He watched as guests began to trickle in, historians, psychologists, culinary scholars, and former students of Calpurnia's, many of them nervously grasping small brochures that explained the exhibit's mission. To explore how memory could be triggered, soothed, or even weaponized through taste. Poirot was not here to make a speech. He had been invited by Giles, quietly, respectfully, but he remained a visitor, a witness, and that suited him fine. Giles now stood at the far end of the hall, dressed in a tailored navy suit, speaking to an older professor. He spotted Poirot and excused himself. "I didn't think you'd come," Giles said with a small smile. "I would not have missed it," Poirot replied. "It is rare to see a house once filled with suspicion, now devoted to study and preservation." Giles gestured to the exhibit. "It was Cecily's idea to add the visitors' booth, the one with the scent diffusers. Each one releases a different spice vapor, no labels. Guests are asked to write what memory they associate with the scent." Poirot smiled, "And in doing so, they become part of the archive." Giles nodded. "It's not just her story now, it's everyone's." They walked in silence for a moment, passing a framed reproduction of Calpurnia's original recipe notes, elegant, looping handwriting, annotations in the margins. "She would have hated this," Giles added. "The openness of it, the mess of letting strangers interpret her work." "Non," Poirot said gently. "She would have protested, yes, but deep down she would have been proud, because what she feared most was not being misunderstood. It was being forgotten." Cecily approached, dressed in a soft charcoal dress, clipboard in hand. "I thought you might like this," she said, offering Poirot a sealed envelope. "It's from her private journal, the final page. We debated whether to display it, but in the end, it felt too intimate." Poirot accepted the envelope with quiet reverence and opened it. "I have spent a life teaching others to taste what they cannot name. But in the end I realized that the true spice of memory is not cinnamon, nor clove, nor almond. It is regret, and it must be tasted alone, so that forgiveness, if it comes, can be shared." There was no signature, only the delicate curve of the final full stop. Poirot folded the note and looked up. "You were right not to display it. Some truths are not meant to be decoded." Cecily nodded. "But they are meant to be remembered." Across the room, a group of young students were leaning into the scent booth, eyes closed, hands scribbling hastily on note cards. Giles gestured toward them. She would have loathed their spelling, but loved their effort. Poirot chuckled softly. "And what of the house?" "We're selling it," Giles said. "With the proceeds going into the foundation. It was a beautiful place, but it belonged to her shadow, not to us." Poirot nodded, satisfied. As the three stood in the center of the exhibit, surrounded by glass and memory, Poirot suddenly reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box. Inside, a single dried bay leaf, a recipe card, and a faded photograph of Calpurnia holding a mortar, laughing beside a younger Giles. "I found this in her travel journal," he said, "unmarked. Perhaps it belongs here." Cecily accepted it carefully. "We'll make a place for it." Poirot looked one last time around the room. The air smelled faintly of saffron and something older, earthy, complex, difficult to name, the scent of history not yet resolved but acknowledged. "Then, mes amis," he said softly, "I will take my leave." "Are you sure?" Cecily asked. "There's still the closing talk." But Poirot was already turning toward the exit. "Ah, non. I prefer beginnings, mademoiselle. And this? This is yours." He stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the doors closing behind him with the hush of velvet curtains. Outside, the world moved on, but inside, in a quiet hall filled with jars and letters and unsaid things, memory no longer slept. It had found breath. It had found spice. And it had found peace. Chapter 18. The Final Taste. It was late evening by the time Hercule Poirot returned to his apartment on Charterhouse Square. The lights of London shimmered beyond the window, gold and ghost-like, and the wind carried the scent of early spring, wet stone, turned soil, and the faintest trace of wood smoke. He removed his gloves, hung his hat with precision, and poured himself a modest tisane of chamomile and orange blossom. The room was quiet, but Poirot's mind was still working. He walked slowly to the bureau where his case files were kept, selected a single cream-colored folder labeled The Edevine Affair, a study in taste, memory, and murder. And then he paused, eyes drifting toward the small bound notebook resting beside the file. A gift from Giles, handed over discreetly after the archive opening. "She wrote this during the last week," the young man had said. "I think you, of all people, would understand what she meant." Poirot opened it now, reading the final 3 pages with careful eyes. They were not confessions. They were reflections. "I never feared dying. I feared being misremembered. I feared becoming a flavor twisted by someone else's tongue. Mrs. Braithwaite watches me constantly. I think she suspects that I'm preparing to make changes she will not accept. She still believes this house belongs to her in a way. But she forgets. It belongs to time now. And Honoria, poor Honoria, she believes herself erased. But she is not. She is the bitterness in every stew, the reminder that absence has a flavor too. One I could not name, and so I left it out. That was my cruelty." Poirot closed the notebook, feeling the finality of her words settle like dust on a sealed spice jar. He had seen every motive, every mistake. Mrs. Braithwaite, whose loyalty became control. Dr. Ellery, whose long-ago betrayal was unearthed like a root rotted through with guilt. Lionel Webb, the envious outsider who wished to write himself into a story never meant for him. Cecily, the quiet observer who understood too much and spoke too late. And finally, Mrs. Pell, the cousin whose silence had been so constant that when she finally acted it was nearly invisible. Each of them had believed they were protecting something, a legacy, a memory, a right. But only Calpurnia had known the truth. There was no protection from time, only transformation. Poirot moved to the fireplace and took down a small glass vial he had taken from the pantry at Gainsborough Mews before the estate had been closed. Inside, a pinch of saffron and a curl of dried cinnamon bark, unlabeled, unsorted. Not forensic evidence, a keepsake. He uncorked the vial gently and inhaled. Warmth, regret, fire. Poirot smiled faintly. Not everything, he thought, could be reconstructed with logic and deduction. Some truths could only be understood through taste. He returned to his desk, picked up his pen, and began to write the final line in the file. The case of Calpurnia Edevane was not a question of who poisoned whom. It was a question of who had forgotten how to remember, and who, in remembering too late, turned memory into murder. He set the pen down. The case was closed, but the lesson lingered. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the city, its bakeries and dust, its gardens and fire, its infinite layers of memory waiting to be tasted again. And in his room, Poirot sat in silence. Content, at last, not with justice, but with understanding.